30 years. That was how long the moon goddess's mark had lived on Mara Voss's left shoulder blade, a silver crescent no larger than a coin, pressed into her skin the night she was born, while the midwife wept and her mother turned her face to the wall. 30 years of covering it, with high collars and careful fabric. 30 years of pretending the dull ache that lived beneath it was nothing more than an old scar pulling in cold weather. 30 years of knowing, in the deepest part of herself, exactly whose name that mark carried, and understanding that he would never claim it. She was folding linen in the eastern storehouse when the bond snapped awake like a rope pulled taut. Not a slow warming, not a gentle nudge. It hit her between the shoulder blades with enough force that she dropped the sheet and grabbed the wooden shelf beside her, her knuckles whitening against the grain. The crescent on her shoulder bloomed silver hot, not burning, not quite pain, but something beyond sensation, as if the mark had remembered something she had spent a decade training herself to forget. She pressed her back against the shelf and breathed through her teeth. Outside, the night sky above the Ashvale compound was wide and moonless, and she could feel, in that particular, terrible way she had learned not to trust, that he was close. Calder Vane, Alpha King of the Northern Reach, had arrived at Ashvale for the first time in 11 years. She knew it before the horn sounded. She knew it before the pack began to stir, before the lights came up in the main lodge, before the housekeeper's footsteps came quick and panicked down the corridor outside. She knew it the way she had always known things about him, through the mark, through the bond that he had publicly, formally, deliberately refused, a bond that had no right to still be breathing after everything he had done to it. Mara, the housekeeper, Bet, pushed open the storehouse door with both hands. Her face was pink. "He's here. The Alpha King is. The convoy is at the gate. Elder Rocha says everyone in service positions is to present in the main courtyard in 20 minutes. "I heard the horn," Mara said. She straightened. She did not let her hand go to her shoulder. "I'll be there." The mark pulsed once, slow and deliberate, as if confirming what she already knew. The problem was not that Calder Vane was here. The problem was that whatever had finally driven him back to Ashvale, after 11 years of silence, had something to do with the bond, and after 30 years, she was no longer willing to let that be his decision to make. She was 12 years old the first time she understood what the mark meant. Elder Rocha had called her into the herb sorting room on a winter afternoon, sat her down at the long table, and placed a cup of warm broth in front of her, as though warmth would make the words easier to carry. Rocha was not a cruel woman. She had the kind of voice that made difficult things sound like weather, unavoidable, impersonal, already on its way. She told Mara that the crescent mark on her shoulder blade was a goddess sign, a soul mark, one of perhaps a dozen documented in pack history across the Northern Reach. It meant that the goddess had chosen her, at the moment of her birth, to carry a bond with a specific wolf, a predetermined mate. It was rare enough that most wolves lived entire lives without encountering one. It was specific enough that the match could be identified through the goddess's own records, kept by the elder priests at the Ashvale shrine. "Who?" Mara had asked. Rocha had wrapped both hands around her own cup. "Calder Vane," she said, "who will, upon his father's death, become Alpha King of the Northern Reach." Mara remembered looking down at her broth. She remembered the steam rising from it and the way the light moved in the room, and thinking, with the peculiar clarity of a 12-year-old confronting something too large to hold, "He will not want this." She was not wrong. She was only wrong about how long it would take to find out. She saw Calder for the first time at the Ashvale Midwinter Assembly, when she was 15 and he was 22 and already carrying his father's authority in the set of his shoulders. He was not the largest wolf in the room. He did not need to be. The pack arranged itself around him the way water arranged itself around stone. Not forced, just inevitable. She remembered the way the light from the assembly fires moved across his jaw, the careful, controlled way he held himself, as though he had learned long ago to take up only the space he had been allotted, and no more. She remembered the exact moment he looked at her. He was halfway across the room, speaking with two of his father's advisors, and then he stopped speaking mid-sentence. Not dramatically, not the way she had imagined, in the private theater of her childhood, that it would happen. Just stopped and turned his head and found her across 40 feet of crowded hall as though something had aimed him. His eyes were gray, the precise gray of winter cloud just before snow, and the mark on her shoulder blade went so hot she nearly lifted her hand to it. She didn't. She kept her face still. She was 15, and she had been preparing for this moment for 3 years, and she would not flinch. He looked at her for 4 seconds, then he looked away and resumed his sentence. She told herself that was fine. She was 15, he was 22, and about to become the most powerful alpha in the Northern Reach. He had looked. That was enough for now. That was more than she had expected. She was 19 the first time they spoke. She had been assigned to the Ashevale Library Archive during the Elder Council's winter convening, which meant carrying records and setting out water and being, in every practical sense, invisible. He had come in late in the afternoon, when the convening had broken for the day, alone, which surprised her because she had never seen him alone in any public space. He moved directly to the east shelf, the historical binding records, the ones that dated to the founding, and she watched him run his finger along the spines until he found what he was looking for and pulled it down. He did not look at her. She should have stayed quiet. She had told herself, getting dressed that morning, that if she encountered him, she would stay quiet. She would be professional. She would not invite. The 1987 convening notes are misfiled, she said. If you're looking for the full record of the Northern Compact amendments, the continuation volume is on the south shelf, 3rd row, behind the Water Registry binders. Someone shelved it incorrectly 6 years ago, and Elder Rocha hasn't had it moved because she uses the misplacement as a test of whether researchers actually know what they're looking for. He turned and looked at her, the gray eyes again. He looked at her the way he had at the assembly 4 years ago, which was the way that made the mark warm, not frantic, not dramatic, just steady and full, as though she was something worth the attention. "You work in the archive," he said. "I do. You know what I'm looking for." "I know what everyone who comes to the historical section is looking for," she said. "You're the only one who comes in alone." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're Mara Voss." "I am." He did not say what she had been waiting 4 years to hear him say. He said, "Thank you for the direction," retrieved the correct volume from the south shelf, and left. But he had known her name. She was 23 when it ended, though end was perhaps the wrong word for something that had never been allowed to formally begin. She had been called before the Alpha King, Calder's father Edric, still ruling then, though his health was failing, along with Elder Rocha and 2 of the senior priests from the Ashevale shrine. The formal session was brief and brutal. Edric Vane had learned of the soul mark. He had consulted his own priests. The match was confirmed. The mark on Mara's shoulder and its resonance with the goddess records was undeniable. And Edric Vane had decided, in the measured, bloodless way of a man who governed well, precisely because he treated everything as a resource problem, that it would not be honored. "Calder will mate with Thessaly Kor," Edric said. Thessaly Kor, whose family held the western border alliances, whose union with the Alpha King would consolidate a decade of political negotiation. The goddess sign is acknowledged and recorded. But it is an old law, and old laws bend under sufficient pressure. Mara had sat in her chair with her hands flat on her thighs and her face completely still. "You'll be compensated," Edric said. "A senior position at Ashvale, full pack protections. The mark will be registered as inactive." "It doesn't go inactive," Mara said. "That's not how soul marks work." Edric looked at her for a moment with something that was almost respect. "No," he said. "I suppose it isn't." He folded his hands. "Nevertheless." She asked, because she had to know, because the rest of her life depended on the answer. Does he know? Edric said nothing, which was itself an answer. She walked out of that session through the main corridor of the Elder Hall and down the front steps into the winter afternoon, and she did not let herself feel it until she was through the storehouse gate and alone among the linen shelves and the smell of dried lavender and cedar, and then she sat down on the floor and pressed her hand over the mark and let herself understand, completely and without softening, what had just been done. She was given 4 months. That was how long it took for the news of Calder Vane's formal mating with Thessaly Corey to reach Ashvale through official channels. 4 months of watching Mara continue her archive work and her linen duties and her contributions to the Elder Council records with the same precise, contained competence she had always demonstrated, and the mark on her shoulder burning every night when the moon rose, and no one in the compound, not Bet, not Elder Rocha, not any of the junior priests, saying her name like it needed to be said carefully. She did not see Calder again during those 4 months. She did not expect to. What she did not expect was the letter. It came through the shrine post, addressed in handwriting she recognized from the archive. She had shelved enough of his administrative notes to know the particular way he made his capital letters, closed and careful, as though he was afraid of taking up too much space on the page. It was 6 sentences long. She memorized it in the first reading and burned it in the second. He said he knew about the mark. He had known for 2 years. He said the choice his father had made was also his choice, offered freely, with full knowledge of what he was refusing. He said he was sorry. He said he hoped the position at Ashvale would be a good life. He said, and this was the sentence she pressed into some locked part of herself and did not take out for years afterward, he said, "I am not free to be what the goddess intended. I hope you can forgive me for that." She did not write back. She did not write back because she understood, with a clarity that was almost merciful, that there was nothing to say. He had known for 2 years. He had stood in the archive and looked at her and already decided. He had chosen, deliberately, the political alliance over the divine one, and she would not have asked him to do otherwise. She could not have asked, because she was 19 and she understood pack law and she understood what was required of an alpha king, but he had not given her the chance to choose. He had not asked. He had taken the decision from her the way his father had taken it, without her in the room, without her voice. He had said, "I hope you can forgive me." She had not forgiven him. She had done something harder. She had gone on. The years between 23 and the night of Calder Vane's arrival at Ashvale were not empty years. They were the years that made her. She became the senior archivist by 27. She built the Ashvale cataloging system from disorganized legacy records into something that other packs sent representatives to study. She learned the full body of goddess law, not because she intended to use it, but because she intended to understand every word of the framework within which her life had been decided without her consent. She read the original founding texts of the Soulmark doctrine. She read the counter-arguments, the dissent records, the 3 cases in pack history where a Soulmark bond had been formally contested by an alpha. She read, very carefully, what had happened in all 3 cases. She did not go to the shrine. She did not seek additional documentation. She waited. because she had learned that the most powerful thing she possessed was patience. Not the passive patience of someone who had given up, but the active patience of someone who understood that some doors only open when the conditions on the other side become impossible to sustain. 30 years. The mark lived. The mark had always been intended to. The main courtyard at Ashvale held 43 people when Mara arrived, 3 minutes before the horn sounded again, the formal welcome call. She took her place in the second row, which was where the senior archive staff stood, to the right of the elder section. Bet was beside her, still pink-cheeked. Elder Rocha was at the front, spine straight, her formal wolf gray stole around her shoulders. The convoy came through the main gate in a line of black vehicles, and the one that stopped at the center of the courtyard opened its rear door before the engine was fully off, as though the man inside had been waiting to move and was done with waiting. Calder Vane stepped out, and the bond hit Mara like a fist. Not metaphorically. She felt it physically, a concussion of heat through the mark, up her spine, into the base of her skull, and she stood very still and let it happen, and kept her face arranged and her hands loose at her sides. 30 years of practice. She could do this. He was older, 52 now to her 45, and he wore it the way certain men wore time, not gracefully, but honestly, the lines on his face earned rather than weathered. The gray at his temples had overtaken the dark entirely. He was still not the largest wolf in the courtyard, and he still didn't need to be. He swept the assembled pack with a single practiced look, the alpha's survey, cataloging, organizing. She watched his gaze track across the second row, and she thought, don't react, give him nothing. His gaze found hers and stopped. 7 seconds. She counted. Then Elder Rocha stepped forward with the formal greeting, and he looked away, and Mara exhaled through her nose and stared at the middle distance and waited for the ceremony to be finished. She learned why he had come within the hour. Thessaly Corey had died 2 years prior, a sudden illness, swift and without warning. The Alpha King had spent 18 months in formal mourning, which pack law required. He had spent the 6 months since navigating the aftermath of what her death had revealed, that without the Western Border Alliance, formalized through their mating bond, the Northern Reach's territorial claims were being contested by 2 neighboring packs. He needed to stabilize. His advisors had apparently told him with great delicacy to consider his options. And then someone had gone back through the goddess records and found the soulmark documentation. Not Calder. Mara was certain, with the absolute certainty of someone who had spent 22 years learning how to read the specific texture of his decisions, that this had not been his idea. He had been brought the information and had done what he had done 30 years ago, accepted the situation, calculated the necessity, arrived at Ashvale to manage it. She was in the archive at 7 o'clock the next morning when he knocked. She heard his footsteps before the knock. She had always been able to identify his footsteps, the particular weight and rhythm of them, which was one of the many things about having a soulmark bond she had never asked to know. She was at her work table with the compound inventory spread before her when he came through the door. She did not look up immediately. She gave herself 2 breaths, and then she looked up, and she said, "Good morning, Alpha King." "Mara." He said her name the way he had said it in the archive 30 years ago, not carefully, not formally, but direct, as though her name were a fact he was confirming. The bond sang between them, audible to no one but her, and she felt the mark warm at her shoulder and pressed her attention to the inventory sheet. "I know why you're here," she said. "You don't need to work up to it." He came further into the room. He looked at the shelves, at the cataloging she had built over 2 decades, and she watched him take it in, the scope of it, the order of it, and she watched him understand. in the way intelligent people understood things they should have understood sooner, something about what she had been doing with the years he had not been here. "The border situation," he began, "is a political problem," she said, "that you're hoping a divine precedent will solve. The Soul Mark documentation legitimizes your claim to the Western territories through goddess law rather than through a mating alliance. Because if the goddess herself designated a bond, that bond carries territorial implications that predate the Cori alliance by 30 years. She looked at him steadily. "I've read the founding texts. I know what the soul mark means, legally. I know what you need." He was quiet. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the first time in the archive, full, steady, without flinching, and she felt the mark burn between her shoulder blades and refused to let it show. "I'm not here only for the legal argument," he said. "I know that too," she said. "And I'm telling you now, before we go any further, that the answer to what you're here for is not automatic. It is not decided because I bear your mark. It is not decided because your political situation requires it. If I agree to honor this bond, it will be because I have decided it serves my life, not because I am the tool that was left in place while you built a different life around a different woman." She had not planned to say that last sentence. It came out level and without heat, which made it, she thought, significantly more effective than if she had said it with feeling. He did not respond immediately. He stood in the middle of the archive with his hands loose at his sides and his gray eyes on her face, and she watched something move through him that she did not have a name for, something old and carefully kept, something he had been carrying for a very long time. "No," he said quietly, "you're not. I know that." "Then we can talk," she said. "But not today. Today I have an inventory to finish." He nodded once and left, and the bond sang after him like a wire pulled to its limit. She made him wait 4 days. Not out of cruelty. She made him wait because she needed 4 days to do what she had been preparing to do, at some level, since she was 12 years old, and Elder Rasha had told her his name. She went to the Ashvale shrine on the second morning, before anyone else was awake, and she stood before the moon goddess's altar and spread the founding texts across the offering table and read them again, not for new information, but to confirm what she already knew. The soul mark doctrine was unambiguous. If a goddess-designated bond existed and was documented, and both parties were living, the bond had standing in goddess law that superseded pack political arrangement. It could not be extinguished by an alpha king's convenience or a dying man's political calculation. It had been waiting, patient as she had learned to be, for the conditions on the other side of the door to become impossible to sustain. She also did something she had not done in 22 years. She went to the small locked box in her room, opened it, and read the 6 sentences she had memorized and burned. She had kept them in memory, the way you kept a wound, not because you wanted the wound, but because forgetting its dimensions made you careless. He had said, "I am not free to be what the goddess intended." She understood, now, what she had not fully understood at 23. He had been afraid, not of the goddess, not of the bond, afraid of what it would cost him to choose against his father, against the political necessity, against everything that had been built around the expectation that he would be the kind of alpha who did not allow private desire to interfere with pack governance. He had been 29 and carrying his father's future, and he had been afraid, and the fear had looked like calculation and had functioned like betrayal, and he had spent 30 years living in the shape of the decision he had made. She could be angry about that. She was, in fact, still angry. A quiet, clean anger, not hot, not performative, just present. The kind of anger that had decided not to destroy itself in expression, and had made itself into something useful instead. She could hold that anger, and she could also hold something else. She could hold the 4 seconds in the assembly hall when he had found her across the room, like something had aimed him. She could hold the careful letters of his name on the archive document spines. She could hold the 7 seconds in the courtyard when he had found her again 30 years later, and stopped. She was not going to pretend the bond was simple. She was not going to pretend what had been done to her was forgivable because it had been done from fear rather than malice. But she was also no longer 23, and she understood now that the choice she made about this bond was hers to make. Not his father's, not his, not the political situation's, hers. On the 4th evening, she sent word that she would meet him in the archive after dinner. He arrived before she did. She found him standing at the east shelf, the same shelf where he had first looked for the wrong volume 30 years ago, and the sight of him there, in the archive, with the archive light falling the way archive light fell and the old spines around him, did something to the mark on her shoulder that she let herself feel, this once, without managing it first. She closed the door behind her. "I need you to understand something," she said, "before I tell you what I've decided." He turned, the gray eyes, the bond between them now so present it was almost a sound in the room. "Whatever we do from this point forward," she said, "happens because I choose it. Not because the goddess marked me, not because your political situation requires me, not because I have been kept in this compound for 30 years within reach, a convenient solution to a problem you created. I am not a resolution to your crisis. I am not a reward for the years you spent honoring a different bond." She paused. "Are we clear on that?" "We are," he said. "Then come here." He crossed the room, and she felt every step of it, the bond pulling taut and then dissolving into something warmer, something she had been carefully not feeling for 30 years. He stopped close enough that she could see the specific gray of his eyes in the archive light, and she reached up and put her hand flat on his chest, not in tenderness yet, just in fact. He was here, he was real, the bond was real, and she was choosing. "I read the founding texts," she said. "I know what the soul mark requires of both parties. I know you'll need to stand in front of the Elder Council and the Border Pack representatives and formally invoke it. I know what that costs you politically in the short term." "I know what it costs me," he said. His voice had changed register, not commanding, not formal, just present, close. "I've known for 30 years what it would cost." She looked up at him. "Then why tonight?" she said quietly. "Why not 30 years ago?" He was quiet for a long time. The archive held them both in its particular stillness, old paper and cedar, and the distant sound of the compound settling for the night. "Because I was a coward," he said. "I did not want to admit that I chose fear over something the goddess herself had sanctioned. I told myself it was governance. I told myself it was necessary." He looked at her with the directness that had, she thought, always been the one quality in him she could not dismiss. It was not governance. It was fear. And I spent 30 years watching the mark on my record stay active and knowing, every time someone brought me the goddess-signed documentation, that I had refused something I had no right to refuse. She let her hand press slightly harder against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat, steadier than she expected, steadier than hers. "I can't forgive you for it," she said. "I know. I can choose to go forward in spite of it. Is that what you're doing?" She looked at him for a moment with the full weight of 30 years behind her, the archive, the linen shelves, the burned letter, the mark that had lived on her shoulder through every season and every decision and every night when the moon rose and pulled at her whether she wanted it to or not. Then she said, "Yes, That is what I'm doing. He raised his hand slowly and touched her jaw, and the bond snapped into full resonance so fast she heard it. A clear, clean sound, like a note held past its natural end. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, which was the first time in 30 years she had let herself be that unguarded in his presence. When she opened them, he was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something stripped of the official weight he carried everywhere, something that looked like a man who had just been allowed, for the first time in a very long time, to put something down. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, slow and deliberate. "I've been wanting to do that since you were 19 and corrected my shelving error," he said. 23 years ago, she said, because she noticed those things, because she had always been counting. "Yes," he said, 23 years ago." She reached up and covered his hand with hers, where it rested against her face, and felt the warmth of him and the bond and the 30 years' weight of it. And she did not kiss him yet. She was not done yet, but she leaned her forehead against his, the old formal gesture of pack greeting between equals, and she felt the mark on her shoulder go quiet for the first time since she was born. Not gone, still there, but quiet, the way something is quiet when it has been answered. "You'll stand before the elder council," she said, close as they were. "You'll invoke the goddess law formally. You'll tell them the border situation is not what's driving this." "It's not what's driving this," he said. "I know, but you'll say it aloud." "Yes," he said, "I will." She pulled back and looked at him, at proper distance, and said, "And you'll wait." Something moved across his face. "How long?" "Not 30 years," she said, and something in her voice turned slightly wry, and she watched the corner of his mouth respond to it, a small, reluctant softening, the kind that arrived before a person remembered they were being serious. But not overnight. "I need to watch you be someone who doesn't choose fear when fear is easier. I've never seen that from you. I need to see it before I let you fully in." "What does that look like?" he asked. "Start tomorrow," she said. "Request the elder council meeting. Invoke the goddess law in front of the border representatives. Do it with no political justification. Do it because it's true." He was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. "Tomorrow," he said. She stepped back further, putting proper space between them, and the bond stretched but held, warm and present, no longer frantic. "Good night, Calder," she said, and she used his name deliberately and watched it land. "Good night, Mara," he said. She turned and went to her work table and gathered her papers, and she heard him leave the archive, his footsteps carrying a different weight now than the weight they had carried on his way in. She sat down at her table when the door was closed and pressed her palm flat over the mark for the last time as a private gesture, felt it warm and quiet beneath her hand, and allowed herself, briefly, to feel the full strangeness of living inside a story that had just changed its shape. The elder council met 2 days later. It was not the intimate conversation she had described. It was 40 people in the formal hall. The council, the border pack representatives, 3 priests from the Ashvale Shrine, Elder Rocha at her place at the long table. Calder stood at the front and spoke without prepared notes, which she knew because she had watched enough of his administrative work to recognize the difference, and he said it plainly. The goddess-designated bond between himself and Mara Voss, senior archivist of Ashvale, had been documented at her birth and registered in the shrine records, and had been suppressed by political arrangement 30 years prior. He was invoking the soul mark doctrine formally, under goddess law, with the intent to honor it. He did not mention the border territories. He did not mention the Western Alliance gap. He did not frame it as necessary. He said, "I refused this 30 years ago because I was afraid of what it required of me." I am not making that argument again. The hall was very quiet. Mara, sitting in the archive staff section, watched Elder Rosha look at her across the room. Rosha's expression was the one she used when a student had finally, after a very long time, answered the question correctly. Mara held the look, and then looked back at the front of the hall, at Calder standing there, with his hands at his sides and the full weight of the formal proceeding on him, and she felt the bond between them warm and steady and patient, and she thought, there it is. There is the first day of something different. The weeks after the council meeting did not resolve into simplicity. Pack politics did not simplify because the goddess law had been invoked. If anything, the territorial challenge intensified briefly, the border packs reading the formal announcement as a sign of instability rather than the sign of authority it was. There were negotiations she was not part of, and deliberations she had no interest in, and 3 formal complaints filed against the Soulmark invocation by parties with their own stakes in the Alpha King's alignment. She read the complaint documents because she kept the archive, and the archive recorded everything, and she noted, specifically, that Calder rejected all 3 challenges without qualification and without asking her to soften her position or stay out of sight while the politics settled. That was the second time she saw him choose differently than he had chosen before. The third time was quieter. He came to the archive in the evenings, on the evenings when his schedule allowed, and he did not come with an agenda. He came and sat across from her work table and read. She had given him access to the full historical collection, which she gave to no one without evaluation, and they worked in the same space, in a silence that felt nothing like the silences she had learned to protect herself inside. Once she looked up and found him watching her over the edge of his document, and he did not look away, and she did not look away, and the bond sat between them warm and unhurried, and she thought, I am not afraid of this anymore. It was 6 weeks after the council meeting that she came to the decision she had been working toward since the night in the archive when she had told him to wait. She had been watching him, as she had said she would. She had watched him say true things in public, at personal cost. She had watched him choose, twice more, to be transparent about the situation, when opacity would have served him better politically. She had watched him arrive in the archive with his official weight stripped off, just himself, gray-eyed and careful and, she thought now, with the distance to see it clearly, lonely, in the specific way of a person who has spent 30 years governing well and choosing wisely and denying the thing that was most true about themselves. She understood that she was not offering him absolution. She was offering him a choice she had made for herself, with herself in mind, because she had become someone who knew the difference. She went to the archive on a Thursday evening and found him already there, at his usual seat, reading something from the 1960s territorial records. The archive light was warm, and the compound was settling into its evening quiet. She stood in the doorway for a moment and let herself feel the full strangeness of this, of the room, of him in it, of the 30 years that had brought her to this specific evening, and then she came in and closed the door. I've made a decision, she said. He set the document down and looked at her. I'm ready to complete the bond, she said. Not because the political situation needs it. Not because the goddess law requires a timeline, because I have watched you for 6 weeks be someone I can trust, and I have decided that is enough to go on. She held his gaze. I want to be clear that this is my choice, made in full knowledge of every alternative. He stood up from his chair slowly, the way people stood when they were being careful not to disturb something they had been afraid of disturbing for a very long time. What do you need from me? He asked. Come here, she said, and stop being careful. He crossed the room, and this time there was no managed distance, no proper space. He put both hands on her face, not tentative, not political, just present and real and warm, and the bond came fully alive between them, 30 years of compressed waiting releasing at once, and she let it. She let it move through the mark on her shoulder and up her spine and into the steadiness of his hands, and she kissed him in the archive where they had first spoken, where she had corrected his shelving error at 19, and where he had come to her again at 52, with 30 years of fear already behind him, and the mark on her shoulder went luminous. She felt it, a warmth that expanded rather than burned, the moon goddess's acknowledgement of something that had been true since the night Mara was born. He held her like she was not fragile, which was how she needed to be held. He kissed her the way she had, somewhere deep in her most private self, always known he would. Carefully, which was how he did everything, but with nothing held back, because there was nothing left to hold back against. When they stopped, she kept her forehead against his jaw and breathed, and the archive was very quiet around them. 30 years, he said softly. Not a complaint, a fact. 30 years, she agreed. She felt him exhale, long and slow, and his arms tightened slightly, and she thought, there it is. There is the part where something that was taut for a very long time finally releases. She had felt it in herself 6 weeks ago in this same room. It was different, watching it happen in someone else. It was better than she had expected. The formal bond completion ceremony happened 3 days later at the Ashvale Shrine, with Elder Rasha officiating and the senior priests present, and 40 members of the pack as witnesses. Because pack law required witnessing, and because Calder had specifically requested a public ceremony rather than a quiet administrative record. She understood that choice. The publicness of it was his acknowledgement that what had been done privately 30 years ago, in rooms she had not been invited into, deserved its correction in plain sight. She wore the formal gray of an Ashvale archivist, and he wore nothing ceremonial at all, just his own presence, and when Elder Rasha asked her if she entered this bond freely and of her own will, she said yes without hesitation, because it was true. The mark on her shoulder went still and certain, in a way it never had before, not burning, not pulling, not reminding her of absence, just present. Just true, the way a thing feels when it has finally arrived at the place it was always traveling toward. She did not forgive him, not in the sense of restoring something to its prior state. Forgiveness implied that the 30 years could be undone, and they could not, and she had no interest in pretending otherwise. What she had done was something different. She had chosen forward, chosen him as he was now, rather than punishing the present for the past, and she had done it on her own terms, with her own name on the decision. That was what the moon goddess had marked her for, she thought. Not for him specifically, not to wait in readiness for an alpha king who would eventually need her. The goddess had marked her for this, for the woman she had become in the 30 years of his absence, capable of making this choice clearly and without desperation, capable of standing in the shrine and saying yes without losing herself in the saying. Calder stood beside her under the shrine's old cedar rafters, and the bond between them sang warm and finished, and she looked at Elder Rasha's careful, satisfied expression, and then she looked out at the assembled pack, and then she let herself look, finally, at him. At the gray eyes that had found her across a crowded hall when she was 15, that had known her name before she had expected it, that had looked at her tonight in the archive with 30 years of careful, costly regret, made into something she could actually stand beside. He looked back at her, present, not careful, done with careful. "I'm not a patient man," he said quietly, beside her. "But I will be, if that's what you need." "You've had 30 years of practice," she said. He turned slightly, so that only she could see his face, and the corner of his mouth lifted, and she felt the bond between them do something she had no word for. Settle, perhaps, into the shape it had always been waiting to take. She was no longer waiting. She was no longer managing, containing, protecting herself from what the mark insisted on feeling. She was here, in the shrine at Ashvale, with the moon goddess's acknowledgement warm on her shoulder and the Alpha King's hands warm at her back and 30 years' worth of her own becoming behind her. And she thought, this is mine. I made this. Every choice I made in those years made this possible, and this is mine. The cedar rafters held the evening light above them, and outside, the first moon of the season was rising over the Ashvale compound, full and silver and entirely unambiguous, the way the goddess's intentions had always been, clear from the beginning, patient enough to wait for the people involved to become worthy of them. She leaned slightly into Calder's side and felt his arm come around her, steady and without performance, and the mark on her shoulder rested quiet and sure, and that was the end of the waiting, and the beginning of everything else.